Tonight's lecture is going to be about the agency of architecture through three lenses. The first lens through the lens of the user, the second lens through the lens of a theorist, and the last and final lens through the lens of a practitioner. And so the scope of this lecture will go from Chicago across to Los Angeles to here in Miami and Northwest Miami-Dade and Opa-locka. Just give you an idea of what we're going to cover over the course of this discussion. The first lens, the user. As was mentioned before, I was raised on the west side of Chicago. This line here is very important. This line separates Chicago proper on the right from Oak Park, a rich suburb, on the left. And so these circles identify some of the early experiences I had with architecture and the built environment. This small circle on the right was my home. That's where my parents lived, I lived, where we grew up. This is called the Austin neighborhood. The Austin neighborhood of Chicago is one of the more impoverished areas at this present moment. It has probably the highest murder rate within the city of Chicago, whereas one point in time, this was a very thriving community. This was an area that had very large graystones, Victorian homes, before a lot of individuals left the neighborhood in the 1970s due to white flight. To the left, the two circles you see are very important. One of those is Frank Lloyd Wright's home. The other is another house that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. So as a youth, I was always put in a situation where there was this border between affluence and poverty. Fortunately enough for me, I grew up in a household that was a typical middle-class household, but the neighborhood was one that was rife with gangs, violence, destruction. And so for me, it was an experience of understanding how the other side of the street lived versus my own neighborhood. So to give you some context, this is the types of homes you will see on the Austin side of Chicago. So these are what's typically called a Chicago bungalow. These bungalows are very prominent. The porch is very important within this architectural typology because this is the space, while informal, where a lot of people of color found as an acceptable social space and a space where they were able to be themselves. It's both public and private. It's both important from a perspective of architecture and from a social aspect as well. This is a place where individuals might see you hanging out with your friends. At the same time, someone may judge you in a negative manner because you're hanging out on your porch as a porch monkey. And so these types of terms and terminology are things that, as a person of color, I've always experienced within the built environment. This is another example of those very gorgeous homes that you might find within these neighborhoods on the west side of Chicago. These are what we call gray stones, not to be confused with New York's brownstones. For us, the limestone is very important. These are homes that you find on the west side of Chicago and the north side of Chicago, and some on the south side. During the early days of the Great Migration, when individuals moved from the south to the north, a lot of people that were black, African Americans, settled on the south side of Chicago until they were allowed via the banks and realtors to move to the west side of Chicago, which at the time was the more affluent area. That's been reversed recently, where a lot of the more affluent African Americans live on the south side of Chicago, not on the west side. But at one point in time, that was the place that you wanted to move to, and that was the sort of goal, to move to these areas. This is what they look like now. So it's a stark contrast from the previous slide you just saw. In these areas, a lot of them are boarded up. They're abandoned. You can get a property like this right now in Chicago for maybe $10,000. And this is a beautiful building that if you have the resources to restore, you have a absolutely amazing architectural feature. It's unfortunate, though, that it's in neighborhoods that, as it currently sits, average maybe 10 to 15 murders every 3 or 4 months, and roughly 100 to 200 violent crimes per month. And it's this weird dynamic of where you can have an amazing structure in a place that is not somewhere that you would actually want to raise a family in some regards. But this was home. This is what I saw. This was my experiences. This is what shaped the way I view the built environment. This is the counterpart. This is on the north side of Chicago. Same housing typology, but much better condition than the ones that you saw before. These gray stones are ones that at the beginning of their construction were seen as single-family homes, whereas now they're viewed as two families. One lives on the first floor, second lives on the second floor. Back home, we call those two flats. It's something that is very unique to the Chicago experience. But all of these things start to make more sense as we go through this exploration of architecture, environment, social standings, identity, culture. This is to give you an idea of the Austin community. So at its heyday, right, 60s, over 130,000 people lived there. At that point in time, the average income level was roughly $120,000 per family. And then in the 60s, after a landmark agreement with Gaucho versus the Chicago Housing Authority, which basically said, you guys are practicing and you are specifically targeting people of color, specifically African Americans, and not allowing them to live in certain locations within the city of Chicago. Once that legislation was passed, a lot of individuals decided to move into the Austin neighborhood. Once they moved into this neighborhood, a lot of the individuals there before ran away. So if you can see between 1960 and 1980, the white population went from 130,000 to roughly 30,000. So 100,000 people moved out of the neighborhood simply because other individuals moved into the neighborhood. So just to give you an idea of how I really start to understand that there are differences in the places that we live, this is a map of Chicago. The big circle again, that's the neighborhood where I grew up. That's my home. And the small circle at the top, that was my elementary school. So that's roughly 10 miles away to go to a different elementary school. This was my high school, roughly 7 miles to get to high school. So if you can imagine, every day I would leave an environment and transverse through a multitude of different environments. And if you've ever been to Chicago, you know that it's one of the most segregated cities in the entire country. You can take one street through the entire neighborhood and see a multitude of different types of housing typologies and different people, and you will clearly know when you're in a different neighborhood. It's a very stark thing for a young person to experience this, to wonder why their neighborhood doesn't look like another neighborhood, and to wonder why they have to travel so far to get the same education as someone else who lives in the same areas. And so at this time, I wasn't aware that a lot of the things that I dealt with was, again, at this intersection of affluence and poverty. It was just something that I experienced without knowing. So on the north side of Chicago, at those places where I went to school, this is what their homes look like, right? So same typology, but different color brick, much better condition. So I would always ask myself, well, why do their homes, why do their houses look better than the ones in my neighborhood? Why are their streets lined with more trees than the neighborhood that I grew up in? Why does my neighborhood have liquor store, vacant lot, and we don't see these things in other neighborhoods, more affluent neighborhoods? This neighborhood is considered Old Town. Old Town is pretty close to the Magnificent Mile, which if you're familiar from Chicago, it's the big strip where all the nice shops are, really expensive. So I would leave from this low-income area and go to a very rich area in downtown Chicago to go to high school. This picture is important because this picture is the neighborhood of my elementary school. This is what's called Edison Park. Edison Park named after Thomas A. Edison, the Thomas A. Edison. So he allowed them to name the neighborhood after them. I went to elementary school in this neighborhood. The average income level here, predominantly Irish community, at the time was between 70 to 80,000. So you're starting to see that a lot of the housing typologies are the same, but there are minor differences where All it takes is a manicured lawn or a chopped shrub or something that clearly changes the experience that one sees when they go through these neighborhoods. This is downtown, the Old Town neighborhood. This is important because this really shifted from an area where there were housing projects to where they were completely razed. So this is my high school, Walter Payton College Prep. Right now, Walter Payton is a top 30 school in the entire country. It's a public school, but it's what is called in Chicago a selective enrollment school. These are schools where one has to test at a certain level to get admittance. And then once they test at a certain level, they have to be eligible for a lottery to get within the school. What's important about this is less than 3 blocks away were the Cabrini Green housing projects. The Cabrini Green housing projects were home to over 15,000 people of color. From the time that Walter Payton College Prep was built in the year 2000 to 2011, when the last building was demolished, only 600 families were replaced within this neighborhood. So he went from 15,000 to 600 families. And the majority of these homes, specifically the Willie Green homes, now you see there's a Target there, were housed in massive towers there. How many of you have ever heard of the movie Candyman? It's an older movie. Candyman was filmed in the Cabrini Green projects. There was a young lady named Girl X, which if you're from Chicago, you know this story. I won't get into the gory details, but she was unfortunately accosted, sexually assaulted, physically abused within the confines of the Willie Green homes of Cabrini Green. This is important because when I went to this high school, they had a planetarium and a black box theater and all the things that one needs to succeed in the world. Right around the corner were people who had no resources. But the people who ran the school and the parents of the children who attended the school had enough clout and power that they were able to expedite the demolishment of these housing towers so that their children could feel safer on their way to high school. So if you lived here, you were considered a second-class citizen to the individuals who went to Walter Payton College Prep. That's one of the things I am not proud of about going to that institution. This is a picture of the Cabrini Green projects, right? So when housing projects were started by FDR, New Deal, the idea was that we would have mid-rise to low-rise housing to help people coming back from the war. That was for people that were white. If you were black, you were put into much more dense housing at a higher scale and then forced to deal with the ramifications of those housing scenarios. Unfortunately, no social constructs were added to those housing situations. So no mental health support, no economic development, no equity, just housing. So as a result, you have things like this. This is one of those Willie Green towers that was being demolished. So over the course of 4 years, from the year 2000 to the year 2004, I witnessed these buildings being slowly taken down one by one and families being displaced one by one. And when it started to happen, a lot of the children from that neighborhood felt a certain way and they reacted within the classrooms. So for a 2-month span, children who grew up in the Cabrini Green neighborhood would stand at street corners and beat up students from Walter Payton College Prep. And there was their way of saying, you came into our neighborhood, you took over where we live, and now you're knocking down our homes? Well, you're gonna feel what this is like. So my sophomore year, I would watch kids get beat up at street corners. The only reason that I was not one of the ones that got jumped by these individuals, because one, I looked like the individuals who were doing the accosting. And two, all I would have to say is, I'm from the west side of Chicago. It's that simple. And then there's a sense of empathy that's understood between individuals like, oh, okay, I get it. You're dealing with the same thing I'm dealing with. You just don't live in a housing project. Little did they know that I had no idea what it was like to be poor. I just lived in a really poor neighborhood. And a lot of individuals conflate the two. That if you grow up in a poor neighborhood, that you are intellectually poor, that you are socially poor, that you are economically poor. And that's just not the way that these things work. Most times, individuals like to settle around other individuals who look like them. And that's specifically important to people of color who move, regardless they're high middle class or low middle class, into areas of extreme poverty because there are other people who look like them. Now, this is where the intersectionality comes into play because a lot of people in architecture don't like to acknowledge these paradigms. Capital A architecture and the ivory tower refuses to acknowledge the social ramifications of their work. So it wasn't until I got to South Africa, Cape Town, that I really started to understand how these things work. So the small circle is where I lived. That's downtown Cape Town. That's city center, that's affluence, that's tall buildings. That's no different than downtown Miami, Brickell, or New York, Manhattan, Soho, or downtown Chicago. I worked in Rondebosch, suburbia, pretty close to a Kendall or in Oak Park. But we did most of our work out here on the periphery. That's Khayelitsha. Khayelitsha is a township. Khayelitsha is where people have to use water spouts that extrude from a tree to get fresh water. Khayelitsha is where a shipping container with stolen products is the local grocery store. Khayelitsha is the place that you see on TV where they say, please donate $1 and you can save a child or something like that, right? The office that I worked for in Rondebosch did a lot of pro bono work within Khayelitsha. And at that point, I started to realize, how do I keep finding myself in these scenarios where architecture takes me to these areas that typically don't get access to what we call good architecture? And why is it that I always live in these neighborhoods where everything is fantastic and wonderful and walkable, but then the majority of the work that I'm doing is always in neighborhoods that are the complete opposite? I wasn't aware that I was beginning to learn a pattern of the way that I practice. And again, this is still at the level of the user, not at the theorist yet. So we jump, come back from Cape Town, South Africa, decide I want to work for Nike for a bit, do some cool designing for Nike, and while that's happening, I'll wait for graduate school. I'll go to graduate school in Los Angeles, go to Woodbury University, where I meet some wonderful people, and I start to theorize that I don't really care about these things yet. I don't quite know what my research agenda is until it's time for my thesis proposal. And my thesis proposal was supposed to be about hip-hop and architecture, blend the two things that I love, a little bit of Kanye West meets built environment, Chicago stand up. I'll make this happen. It's going to be the best thesis ever. Everybody's going to love it. And then my professor, Princeton grad, Getty fellow, says to me, you can't blend race and architecture. That's not what we do. We have no control over those social issues. Pick something else. Now, I've always fashioned myself as a bit of a smartass, and at that moment, I decided, challenge accepted. Changing the whole thesis, we're doing race and architecture. You're going to hate me by the time I'm done with this semester. So we move forward. We start to research because the last thing you want is to make a controversial proposal where you don't know enough history. So I started to research public housing, which is typically what's deemed black architecture to the uninformed. It's not shotgun homes. It's not the porch. It's not the things that were taken from West Africa when slaves were taken and then adopted into American vernacular and then created and then made the sort of crowning achievement of American architecture, right? It's not those interventions. It's public housing. It's the thing that has the connotation of negativity. And so from there, I told you guys before, the Gaucho versus CHA, which is very important because that basically said it is not okay to create slums. It is not okay to create substandard housing, specifically for black people. This is during Jim Crow era United States of America, where most black people were forced to live in what's called kitchenettes, 400 square foot apartments on the south side of Chicago. Okay? Then we progress to Section 8 housing, which are voucher systems to sort of try to even the playing field. Those didn't work. We move on to Hope 6 in hopes that clearly the idea of the tabula rasa and knocking down everything, building from scratch, modernist ideals, so we can build these tall towers, place families within them, and they'll thrive without any social help. Those don't work, so maybe if we knock them down, do low-rise, row homes, row houses, using Hope 6, we can solve these issues. Didn't work that way, right? So this is Los Angeles. I started to map where are all of the resources within LA. The minuses are clearly negative, low-income areas of Los Angeles County. The pluses are high-income areas of Los Angeles County. I started to find out that there started to create this sort of invisible wall of resources. That wall manifested itself into Brentwood, Bel Air, Beverly Hills. These places had high levels of intellectual equity, high levels of social equity, and high levels of financial equity. Their counterparts to the east did not. Start to find out where are the best elementary schools. Pacific Palisades, Palos Verdes, some around in Malibu. They're not in central Los Angeles. Central LA is where USC is. I like to call USC the University of Spoiled Children. And then there's also UCLA, which is in Brentwood on the west side, right? There's these private schools. UCLA isn't private, it's a public school, but USC is a private school. It's a very well-to-do school. But it's in the middle of what we call the hood. But there's these massive walls that act as fortresses to not allow people in the neighborhood within the campus. Right, we want to barricade ourselves from the people who call this area home. High schools, more the same, right? So always in the same area. If you're within downtown Los Angeles, you probably don't have good prospects. Downtown LA is now where we have Skid Row. A lot of people have heard that term before. You see a lot of tenements of homeless individuals around the neighborhood. NBA All-Star Weekend was just there. February 15th, 16th, and 17th. And I can guarantee you that they stayed clear of that area and within what's considered LA Live. It's a small little complex of entertainment meets Disney meets adult. And it keeps you completely clear of the ills of the neighborhood on the outside, on the outskirts of that neighborhood. So there's these invisible walls, and then there's literal walls. Right? So if you go to Liberty City right now, you will see a race wall. Race wall being defined literally as a wall to split communities so that white people and black people do not see each other. Because it was legal through housing practices for banks to say, I don't want to develop or invest in communities with black people. So the consistent line here still exists. That's what it looks like in its current manifestation. At its tallest point, that wall was 10 feet tall. 10 feet is the height of a basketball hoop, just for point of reference, give you an idea how tall it is. 10 feet is taller than that exit sign to the rear. So if you could imagine, if you're on the wrong side of that wall, you don't understand what's going on. You don't know why you have to succumb to these archaic rituals of oppression. And again, these are all things that happen within the built environment that architecture doesn't want to talk about, that a lot of people who practice want to avoid. That how do we have these conversations? Because then we're forced to look into the mirror about what we do as practitioners. They're in Pompano Beach. Liberty City is not unique. If you go to Detroit, you'll see them there. They're all over the country. It was a means of exclusion that was used by people in power. And once those walls were demolished, people started to create highway systems instead. These highways allowed for families to escape the city and escape urbanity and escape the interaction between social groups and ethnicities and flee to an area where they can be around homogeneity, right? So that's always the goal. This is a good example of the tall wall that if you go to Pompano Beach, you will see this. And you can see on the other side a regular single-family home neighborhood, probably zoned R1. Whereas the other side of the home, everything is multifamily. And so as you saw before, it's this dynamic of let's knock down the single-family home, let's remove the porch, let's remove community, let's erect multifamily housing, and force people to live in resources that are vastly different than what they are originally accustomed to. Then we start to get into data. So how does Hope 6 work? Hope 6 is supposed to restore housing that it demolishes. So again, from the perspective of the theorist, you start to see, here's a good diagram, that you knock down a tall building, you don't replace the same building. You replace half of the building. So now, where do the other individuals move to? Well, let's give them vouchers. We'll give them vouchers and we'll say, you can move wherever you want with this Willy Wonka golden ticket. The only problem is that golden ticket isn't valid in all currencies. Certain neighborhoods do not accept said golden ticket. So now where do you live? Displacement is a real issue. This has nothing to do with gentrification, right? That's a totally different boogeyman. This is purely based off of housing policies that we've allowed to be enacted. You start to see the family types, household incomes. Over 2.3 million people lived in public housing. All this information was taken from the year 2012, okay? So it's still recent, 6 years ago. You start to see household income, extremely low poverty, average annual income of under $14,000. And that's perceived as a family of four. So if you can imagine 4 people bringing in $13,318. Or a family of 4 bringing in a little bit more than that, which is considered very low income, so maybe $20,000. And all these things were, again, really starting to influence the way that I view the world. You start to see that when it comes to development, there's always this term AMI, average median income. That phrase is really what governs a lot of our housing development, our affordable housing development, our workforce housing development, because those numbers dictate who gets to live in certain buildings. So how many of you guys, by a show of hands, have heard Miami doesn't have any affordable housing? Right? But according to AMI standards and housing standards, Miami has a plethora of affordable housing because it's determined by the AMI. So if your average median income is $60,000 a year, or $70,000 a year because it's taken from an area like Brickell or Midtown or Design District, then we do have affordable housing. People can afford to pay $16.25 a month, or $18.25 a month, or $21.20. I see somebody shaking their head saying no, but that's how it's defined. Is what they say is that you can. I'm saying these numbers because I pay $16.25 a month, right? So I see this on a daily basis. But based off of the letter of the law, that is defined as affordable housing because of the neighborhood that I live in and the locally sourced incomes. And so once I realized how these things work, I decided to interrogate, well, how would I fix public housing? How can I address this from a speculative proposal, whereas I know this probably is not possible, but let's just entertain the idea, right? So one of the issues with public housing is I hear everything above me. The floor to ceiling is too loud. Well, what if we raise the building so that now no ceiling and no floors touch? Okay? The next issue, the walls are too thin. I hear everything that's happening in my neighbor's house. I heard of domestic violence last night, or sexual activity the night before that, or those kids keep playing their Xbox too loud. What if we change the operations and we create this shared wall dynamic where there are no shared walls? Maybe we rotate, maybe we shift, maybe we aggregate, right? How do we redefine these housing paradigms? Again, purely speculative. Because again, remember, the point of this project is just to stick it to my professor, right? He told me I couldn't do this. Let me piss him off as much as I possibly can. So then we get to, well, how do you brand the building? Okay, let's think back to how one experiences the world. When you're in the privacy of your own home, you're yourself. You're free. You can do whatever it is you like to do. You can pick your nose. You can dance. You can make up your own language. You can do karate in your garage. It's up to you. But the more public those spaces become, the more you have to adjust who you are. And I didn't realize, as a person of color, I really had to subscribe to this. When I'm at home, I can listen to rap music. I can wear my baggy clothes. I can speak in slang. But when I get into academia, when I get into the built environment, can't do that. Got to change it. Because then, if I don't, I'm perceived in a certain lens that I don't want to be perceived as. So now, how do you go from extremely black to extremely white, right? So how do you shift in the built environment so that you can assimilate with everyone else? So my proposal was, wherever my housing project would land, whatever public or private amenity it attached itself to, the building would respond by changing its appearance on the outside. The facade would change its colors. The way that I came up with these social conditions and the social programs that the building would attach to was based off of our US government. So I discovered that there was this website. It was through the US Gov, HUD, I forget the complete address, but it essentially said that if you want to be a productive American, you needed to check 7 boxes, okay? I don't remember the 7 boxes, but I remember 4 of them. One is you need access to quality mental health. You need access to quality early childhood education. You need quality to healthy and fresh food. You need access to quality health care. And you need access to elementary and high school education. Now, when I showed you guys before, the neighborhood I grew up in, we did not have access to those things. It didn't happen. They were all on other sides of town, north side of Chicago, west side of Los Angeles. What if we take this housing development and we place it where all these amazing social things are, these services that everybody needs? What if we go put them into the rich neighborhoods where they don't want them to be? What if the outside of the building, which changes colors, influences the inside of the floor plan? Similar to how when we go out in the real world, the things that are said to us not only affect us at a surface level, but also an internal level. The things that we hear, the things that we see when a young woman clutches her purse and crosses the street, or when you stand in an elevator and a person moves 3 steps away from you, and you don't show them out loud, you don't vocalize them, you internalize them, can architecture do the same thing? So the stripes, which change the appearance of the building, change the inside of the floor plans. So then we have a site plan, okay? So this is the housing development. The housing development does not subscribe to typical urban planning conventions. The idea being, well, if we smash all the homes of the people who live in this very rich neighborhood and then force them to live in the housing projects with the other people, then we get true mixed income. We get people who make a lot of money with people who make no money. And now this forced interaction creates new social paradigms. And while we're at it, let's place it on the best elementary school in the city of Los Angeles. So that if you're a kid and you live there, you're able to go inside of this school without ever having to leave your neighborhood. When I proposed this, I had a juror who stood up and very adamantly said to me, "That project's racist." To which I responded with, "You don't know what that word means." Now, she looked at me and she said, "Well, yes, I do. This is a racist project." I said, "Well, you clearly don't know because I'm black. I can't be racist. It's not the way it works, okay? I don't have power. I don't have institutionalized power. I can oppress you with that institutionalized power. I can make theoretical projects that are racial, but not racist. So maybe you should go back and try to learn what that word means." That didn't really go over well, because that juror was also my professor. Okay, just give you an idea of how these things start to work. But then my thesis advisor said to me, "Well, Germane, if you're not pissing people off, you're not doing your project right." Okay, so what I started to do was I started to write these fictional articles in a fictional newspaper. And every time a juror would say something to me like "not in my backyard" or "that's racist," I would make an article in response to that person. And then when I had my thesis presentation, I printed it on newsprint, and I handed these newspapers out to the jurors, right? So influencing the propaganda to the project to let them know, well, here's what you believe. These are the conventions that you subscribe to. You want to help poor people. You want to help people of color, but you don't want it in your neighborhood. You don't want to be there. You're too worried about your property values. You're too worried about your tax credits. So do you really want to help? Or is this just lip service? So this is a building section, right? So again, we know theoretical, speculative. You can't really raise buildings like this. If it is structurally possible, but it's so expensive that what person would actually allow this to happen? But just the idea of it creates those conversations that architecture very rarely wants to have, right? So a zoom-in version, you had to have somebody surfing. This was in Los Angeles. Everybody surfs in LA. Nobody just sits on the beach. It's just kind of not a thing that you do. It's too cold. It's not like Miami where the water is so warm and everybody's hanging out. LA beach, people are in sweaters. They're in scarves. It's a completely different culture. Like, you don't ever have to get in the water, and I love it because I am not from a place that has a lot of water, so I don't really care about the beach. So it worked out perfectly for me. This was the elementary school in the neighborhood, right? So inside of a social housing project is the best school in all of Los Angeles. People look at me like I was crazy when I proposed that. I don't understand why that's such a crazy proposal, that you would try to help people who need to be helped. I mean, it seems pretty simplistic to me. This is what the building looked like if it were to take over the concrete, take over the neighborhood, take over the street, just completely barricade everything, interrupt everybody's daily conventions, right? So the theorist, vastly different than the user. The theorist is able to be speculative and sit in a room of suspended disbelief, whereas the user really has to understand how these things affect the daily life. This is the building on top of the school, right? So you can see the school underneath. And sort of just, the building had a parasitic relationship with the elementary school, and parasitic in a relationship of one person gaining at the detriment of another person, specifically black people gaining at the expense of white people, because that's something that's been done in this country for a very freaking long time. So I felt like it was okay to switch it. It's like, I'm not about to turn the other cheek. I'm about to, let's just do the same thing to you that you did to us, and then we'll see how you like it, and then we'll move forward from there. That professor didn't like that either. That professor was like, this is super racist now, to which I was like, yes, this is going exactly how I wanted it to go. This is fantastic. Long story short, I won the thesis prize. So like, that person ended up crying at the review. I'm not making that up. They cried there. They stood up and they said to me, "Oh my God, I had no idea what was going on with the project. This is a personal story of yours. This is a self-narrative." And I was like, nah, man, this is just a project I came up with. Like, this is all it is. And it was like, no, this is you. This is your story. This is what you experienced. This is you. It's like, nah, this is just a story. This is anybody that grew up on the west side of Chicago. I'm not really special. But then once I stepped back, I understood that it really was a self-narrative, right? I really was chronicling how I experienced the built environment, and I just didn't realize it because I was so focused on the project. I was fortunate enough that that thesis project propelled into a real proposal. So the reason why I'm in Miami now is the Made in Opa-locka initiative in Opa-locka, Florida, which is considered Northwest Miami-Dade. It borders Miami Gardens, Hialeah, unincorporated Miami-Dade. Our proposal, again, Made in Opa-locka, was based off this neighborhood called the Triangle. The Triangle, during the 80s, had the highest murder rate in the entire United States. The Triangle is also only about 1/3 of a mile in diameter. It is very tiny. There are 115 structures in the Triangle. 15% of those are churches. Okay? Say that one more time. There's 115 structures, 15% of those are churches. And that's because in a lot of impoverished communities and communities of color, people depend on faith. Not government, because government fails. Not people, because people fail. But whatever God that they believe in. So our proposal calls for me moving from LA into this neighborhood. Because I felt as though, how do we help a neighborhood if somebody doesn't live there? Right? It doesn't have to be me. It can be you, Christian, or you, Jennifer, but one of us have to live there. Christian and Jennifer were my two thesis advisors, right? So they're both Harvard GSD grads. Jennifer is from rural Alabama. Christian's from Los Angeles. They're, and I'm going to say this on camera, two of the whitest people you will ever meet. But they worked out so well for my thesis proposal because they had so much knowledge, and they enriched my life to a point where I really understood what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I was fortunate enough to where the proposal that they found via the NEA Our Town grants, they asked me to be a part of the team. They're like, hey, we're going to use your thesis as inspiration for this project. So do you want to be a part of the team? Do you want to see what it's like to work on in real life what you did theoretically? It's like, of course I do. So this is a true story. I kicked my mom out of the house because I also graduated that week, but I needed to fly to Miami to pitch the project, and Jennifer and Christian wanted me to do all the talking. So I said, hey, Ma, you have to leave like 4 days early because I got to fly to Miami unless you want to stay here, and I'll see you when I get back. They decided to leave, so then I flew to Miami. I met with a lot of very important individuals. One of them is here in the crowd. She's in the back over there. Her name's Eileen Allen. She works at the Opa-locka Community Development Corporation. She's the director of arts and culture there. And she was one of the ones that basically selected our team to try to redevelop this neighborhood. And we tried to do that via what we call public houses and micro enterprises. Public houses being a riff on the term public housing, public amenities, public spaces that the community thought they needed, and micro enterprises allowing people in the neighborhood to capitalize off of their own resources, their own skill set, so that we don't have to gentrify their neighborhood. This is the housing stock of the Triangle. A lot of homes are like this. This area of Opa-locka, the lots are only 25 by 90. That's important because a typical Opa-locka lot is 50 by 90. But because of those same segregation laws, people in this neighborhood were only given half the lot. So Opa-locka was settled around the exact same time as Miami Beach and Coral Gables. All of them were settled within a 3-year span between 1912 and 1915. Opa-locka was settled by an aviator named Glenn Curtis. He had an affinity for Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, so he modeled the city after Moorish Revival architecture. So the city of Opa-locka has the largest collection of Moorish Revival architecture in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, so if you go there, you see these really crazy domed structures And they're located on Alibaba Avenue, adjacent to Sinbad Street, across from Purvis Avenue. This is all real. I'm not making this up. This is a real thing. If you go north, you will see this. Our office is up there. And so imagine a kid that moves from LA to this neighborhood. So I move here, I walk around, I take photographs of every single home within the neighborhood to understand what the housing stock is for this area, to ingratiate myself with the people in the community. The first week, all I heard was, "Are you the police?" I was like, "Well, do I look like the police?" "Well, we don't know. Are you?" It's like, "No, I'm just a student." I lied. I was like, "I'm just a student. I'm just doing a project, doing some work. Want to talk to me or not?" Kept moving around. All they had in that neighborhood was a tiny little empty lot that they called the parklet. That parklet was something that they held community meetings at, that we had these pop-up parks or health fairs and stuff. It was a tiny patch of land with a wrought iron fence, and that was it. From there, you see buildings like this. Now, one of the issues with this neighborhood is there's a lack of ownership. You can't find the people that own the homes in the neighborhood because all those people are deceased. And the homes are in flux because there's a child that might think they own it, but they find out they have an illegitimate half-sibling somewhere else. I'm not making that up. That's a real thing. We tried to buy this house, and Eileen, you remember this? When we first tried and we tried to find out who owned the place, and we found out that there was a guy that owned it that had a side girlfriend. They also had kids. So the blood kids by marriage didn't like the side family, so there was a bit of turmoil, and they wouldn't give up the structure. But then once they rectified everything, and it's like, well, maybe we can make some money off of this, they asked for about $100,000 for a structure that appraised at like $8,000. So we looked at them like they were crazy, obviously. It's like, we're not paying you $100,000 for a property that you can just buy for $8,000. It just makes no sense. That's absurd. But we had to create the public houses. So the idea was that we'd have a space for performance, because there was nowhere in the neighborhood that people could actually go to have a baby shower or a wedding reception or a party for their kids or a quinceañera or any of these things like that. So maybe that's what we give them. Then we thought, for the micro enterprises, what skill set do we see from people in the neighborhood? Well, there's a lot of bikes, because people don't own cars. Maybe they can fix a bike. There's a lot of people that cook. Now there's a restaurant in Opa-locka called Crabman 305 that was started out of the grandmother's garage, right? Because in Florida, up to $15,000, you can make money via the cottage industry law. But Opa-locka's code was so backwards, they didn't allow live-work zoning. So the state code allowed it, but the city code did not allow it. So now we had to try to rewrite the comprehensive code. But all of these proposals we were doing was without the input of the community, right? This was my first year moving here. Let's just do what we think they need. All the stuff I said as the theorist that I would not do. Fortunately enough, we did talk to people in the neighborhood, and we ended up not doing what we thought they needed, but what they said they wanted. And that's where ownership comes into play. Because if you give someone something for free, they might care, but they will not care as much as if they had a hand in creating it. And so this is very important. This is the first project that we completed within my first year here within Miami, Florida. This was a vacant lot within the Triangle. We only owned one tiny portion of that lot. The rest of it we kind of just took and figured if somebody had a problem with it, they can come find us. So all of this here, I don't know who owns that. All of that there, no clue who owns that. All we owned was this little patch of dirt, like right here, right? And I'm not making this up. Again, Eileen's right there. So when this ends, if you want to ask her, she'll tell you the same thing. And so we were able to get a Kaboom grant to build a park that's here. And we sourced what kind of things the park would have from the kids that live in the neighborhood. So what would you like to play on? We want swings, we want slides. Okay, we'll make that happen. But then in the back, you see all these trees, right, all these palm trees. Those were planted by myself, our community organizer, Chris Davis, and the local drug dealers in the neighborhood of the Triangle. I'm not making that up, right? That is the truth. We had food. We had these little granola bars, you know, the little Quaker Oats granola bars that everybody gives away for free at Publix. We had those off to the side, and there was a group of guys that walked past and saw Chris and I cutting all of these pieces of wood to hold up the trees. Now, what they don't tell you about Kaboom Parks is that the first 2 days, you're on your own. You're trying to build all the prep things so that when the large group of people come, the 300 volunteers, they don't hurt themselves. All they have to do is screw a couple times and it's finished. All they have to do is drop a little bit of mulch and it's done. But those first 2 days are hell, because those 2 days are when you're doing all the site prep. So Chris and I are out there just cutting wood, literally. Cutting. I'm watching the guy stare at us. So I scream, "You gonna help or you gonna stand there?" Some guys walk away. One guy says, "Well, I don't know how to cut wood." It's like, "Well, bring your ass over here. I'll help you. I'll show you how to do it." So the guy comes around. I say, "We're gonna do this like a Ford assembly line. I saw, you cut, we put it over here, we erect the tree, we move on to the next one." So trying to give skills while doing this process. He helps us for a couple of hours. Mind you, all this is going on, Eileen gets to sit at the registration table and just sign paperwork. So she doesn't actually have to actually lift anything. She gets to watch us do all of this hard work and all of this hard labor. You know it's true. So we finish doing these things, and the next thing you know, the guy leaves. We go to the big day where the mayor comes, they're doing the photo ops, everybody's taking all their glamorous pictures about the park that came out of nowhere. And I see the drug dealer and his daughter walk up to the park. So I'm like, all right, what's gonna happen right now? What are they gonna do? So I inch a little bit closer, but not close enough to be a creep, but close enough to overhear what's going on in the conversation. And so the guy tells his daughter, "Your daddy helped build this." So I'm like, yes, I don't have to worry about anything now. It's not going to be destroyed 3 weeks later, because he knows that because he spent the time, he put in the sweat equity, if his knucklehead friends want to destroy it, they're knocking down the things that you spent 2 hours out of your day helping to build. People in the community are the ones that help to keep these things going. As you guys might know, Opa-locka has its own issues, governmental, that I will not get into. So a lot of times, a lot of these relationships have to be made at a grassroots level. Nothing you can do about it. These are kids in the neighborhood playing in the park. We got those tables donated as well. That mural in the background was done by some FIU students. And I have no idea who owns that building that they put the mural on. I don't care who owns the building that they put the mural on. If that person has a problem, they can come find me. It's not that hard to find me, right? Better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. So we continued that same process as we continue to try to redevelop a lot of these neighborhoods. This is our crown jewel. This is the Arts and Recreation Center. The mural was done by an artist out of New York, Opa-locka Jaifu, right? He just recently had a commission at Coachella called Crown Ether, so now he's well on his way to like stardom. This streetscape was done by Walter Hood out of Oakland. And what's important about this is, because there's nobody on the ground here in Miami, Eileen would send me out into the neighborhood to go find out all the dimensions and do all the mappings for a lot of these areas to find out how we're going to do this kind of stuff. And so since I moved here from Los Angeles, the relationship with the CDC was one where that I would do all the in-house design services, all the way up to design development, and then we would hand those off to our licensed architect who would finish the rest of the proposals. And so this is where our offices are. This is where the arts and creative staff is housed. I say it like that's a big staff. That's only 3 people, right? It's not a lot of people at all. That's Eileen, Ashley Cover, and myself when I'm there, and I'm not even always there. This is the inside. It's a very flexible space. This is where we have art shows, art galleries, poetry slams. In a couple weeks, the Young Arts Foundation is going to have an event there as well. What's cool about the space is if you're an Opa-locka resident, you can rent the space for the entire day for like $200, $300. because all we care about is keeping the lights on. So if you can cover the cost of keeping the lights on, then you can use the space for whatever you want to need it to. But this is also a space people in the community really care about. We've had over 300 people in there for a poetry slam because that's what people in the neighborhood really care about. We've had over 200 people in there for fashion shows. The capacity is like 75 people. To give you an idea of how many people are supposed to be in there versus what are actually in there. Behind it, we had plans to create an urban farm because Opa-locka is a food desert. And food desert being defined as no locally grown fresh food sources within, I think it's like a 5-mile radius, where there are no supermarkets in the entire city of Opa-locka. If you want fresh foods, you have to go to Miami Gardens, to the worst Winn-Dixie of all time. I know because I lived in Opa-locka and I had to go to that Winn-Dixie. If you want to know how annoying fruit flies are, go try to buy produce from this place. That was until I learned about the Publix in North Miami, but that was like 4 miles away. But I was fortunate enough to have a car so I can drive to that Publix. But everybody in the neighborhood didn't have those capabilities. Most people had to go to a local convenience store and buy maybe a banana or two or an orange or a lemon, and that was their fresh food source. That or the local Family Dollar, which basically all had processed food, and it's really the only access they had. So we started to develop how we can design an urban farm for the neighborhood. So we went through all these different iterations of designs. How can we make this both helpful and aesthetically pleasing? And so this is the Arts and Recreation Center. This was the urban farm behind it. We partnered with a organization called Foodscapes because even though I am a designer, I know nothing about horticulture. Again, I'm from the west side of Chicago. We don't even have trees. I never saw stars until I left the country because there's so much light pollution that I had no idea what they look like. And so we started to have it, right? So we started to build the farm, and that's there behind the Arts and Recreation Center. That's what it looks like now. We're starting to harvest things there. This was maybe a 2.5-year endeavor, I believe, maybe a little bit longer than that. You can start to see that the building, the mural is starting to fade a little, and that's because it's not a painted mural. And it's not painted because the city of Opa-locka said, this doesn't subscribe to our Moorish values, even though it's clearly a Moorish-inspired design. And they said, you only can have this up temporarily for 30 days. Once we erected the design, they had a professional photographer take a picture of the building, and it's now in City Hall. So I'll give you an idea of the things that we deal with on a regular basis, where we were not supposed to have it, we did it anyway, and now it's still there. The building is currently about to start going through renovations to reapply the mural, so it goes back to how beautiful it was in that earlier image you saw before, because Miami's sun is destructive and hurricanes are destructive. And Opa-locka is one of those neighborhoods that was without power for an additional 2 weeks beyond everybody else when it came to no power, no water. And we were fortunate enough to where we used the Arts and Recreation Center as a disaster relief place where we can hand out goods and services to people in the community. This is the last slide. This is to give you an idea that we really are starting to grow things there. I wasn't there when the things were actually put within the ground because I also teach at the University of Miami, and these things were done while I was in class. But it's really awesome to see all of these fresh foods growing. We have everything from peppers to strawberries to collard greens, mustard greens, kale, so many fresh foods that people in the neighborhood otherwise would not have ever had access to. So I want to end, so we can have some time for discussion, with these 3 parallels, right? So there's the user, the naive person who doesn't understand what's going on, the ignorant individual, and I'm talking specifically about myself, who was able to transition to the theorist that dealt with issues of inclusion and exclusion from an academic perspective, and whether or not these topics are worthwhile for us to discuss within academia or architecture as a whole. To now, the practitioner who decided, well, I don't care if we're not allowed to, I'm going to do this work anyway, because I feel as though the things that I have seen growing up in my neighborhood other people should not have to experience. So if we can make these spaces a little bit better, maybe we should attempt to do so. Thank you for your time.
That was like something really, it really impacted me, because I always knew that there was, of course, like this imaginary wall of sorts, because even driving around this area, depending by where you go, you get that change, that drastic, change that you're speaking about. Like, and I don't know how really I can help. I don't know exactly, because I see myself going to some of these places, like the Panther Coffee that's about to open over there. But at the same time, I'm like, whoa, I'm part of the problem here. So I feel kind of, I don't know if I should go to these places and eat and have coffee. What can we do?
Well, I don't think you should feel guilty for patronizing some of these places. But there is a certain level of complicitness that artists have when it comes to displacing communities. Because if you're willing to put your own practice ahead of a neighborhood because you're able to get subsidized rent, then some people are going to do that. Mm-hmm. And so when I moved here in 2013, Winwood was not the Winwood we see today. There were still art walks. There were still a lot of the Puerto Rican families that were there. There were still a lot of these single-family homes, whereas now those are knocked down. There's a lot of multifamily development. But the issue becomes, how do you mitigate that change while also empowering the people in the neighborhood? And so you're able to do that if you give the people in the neighborhood the resources to help themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I live in North Miami, a city that is mainly Haitian.
Okay.
And I want to get your opinion about gentrification.
Okay.
Because you didn't want to touch the subject. You basically concentrated in black and white. Mm-hmm. Are we going to go with this development? Is there really a plan? What's your vision on that?
Okay.
Your point of view, and where you think Miami is going with this subject?
Okay, so the reason why I did not touch on gentrification in my presentation is because that's something that we can talk about for 10 hours in a row, right? There's just not enough time in the world to talk about such a complex scenario. Because what people don't like to acknowledge is gentrification can also happen with the same race and the same ethnicity, right? If there's a bunch of black people or white people or Puerto Rican or Mexican or whatever you want to call it that live in a neighborhood that are of a certain socioeconomic standard, and in the same demographic move in at a higher economic standard, that's still gentrification. But it's acceptable because it's the same people, right? So when everybody thinks of gentrification, the boogeyman, they think of it as people of color being displaced by people who are not of color. So for me specifically, I believe in responsible development. Responsible development defined as people in the community understand what new developments are coming to them. Not in the guise of, we made an advertisement in the Miami Herald, nobody knew about it, we made it at a time where nobody could attend, and then we passed said development, law, bill, whatever, right? But we want to do this. We've let everyone know this is what we want to do. We've given everyone the opportunity to say their voice, which at these public hearings, everyone is allowed to speak their voice. I know because I sit on the Planning and Zoning Council for the city of Opa-locka. So I know this from a policy standpoint. I'm the kid that sits there with a baseball cap on backwards, and I specifically do that so that when developers come to the neighborhood and they try to pass one over me, then I perk up and I smile and say, hey, yeah, I actually am educated. I just didn't get a haircut this week, so I'm wearing a baseball cap, and what you're proposing doesn't actually help this neighborhood. This helps line your pockets, and once you get your developer's fee, you're going to skate and run away, and these houses that you build will no longer actually be occupied by workforce individuals. Now, the problem is those boards are by volunteers. A lot of people don't like volunteering their time. A lot of people like to say they want things until they have to be put into action. And that's always the hard part. Because there are a lot of times where I do not want to drive from Coral Gables at 6 p.m. after a 4-hour studio to Opa-locka at 7 o'clock to sit there for 2 hours and go over a development agreement for a building that it should never been in the first place because the code was written incorrectly. And that's the issue that you find in Miami, because Miami is a very young city. Miami is still growing. Miami is still finding its footing. And as a result, you have wide-scale development. Miami was never really rocked by the 2008-2009 housing recession. You didn't feel it like we felt it in Chicago or these other locations, right? You were able to bounce back very quickly. So as a result, you have this influx of external wealth, of foreign dollars that create development, but don't create individuals who live within the development. So now you get these large-scale developments like in Little River, Magic City, which is supposed to bring in young professionals from across the world to live in a maker development in a neighborhood that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's not built in community. No, I don't. I do not disagree with you, right? I do not disagree with you. But one of the issues is density. As we continue to have people flock to urban cores, where do they live? And that's why it's a very complex issue. It's not as simple as we don't want to displace people and let's go ahead and everybody save the world. There are certain levels you have to understand where if 60 or 70% of the world's population will live in urban cores and there's not enough land for those people, you have to build up. But now if you build up, you remove the things that create community, like the front lawn, like the porch, that create these social interactions. So it's not as simple as, Germane, what's your opinion on these things, where I'm able to take a step back and I'm no longer the user, I'm no longer the theorist, I'm the practitioner that understands there are a lot of steps that come before stopping this situation. I know in Opa-locka what we've done is we've tried to empower people in the neighborhood by giving them all the required skills to succeed. But once I give you these skills, it's up to you to act on them. We can give you housing counseling sessions that make you eligible for HUD housing. You have to come to the class. We can have a health fair that teaches you healthy food habits. You have to come to the health fair. And that's the part nobody ever wants to talk about. It's the accountability of the individual. Nobody wants to talk about that. Everybody wants to blame the boogeyman, the developer. And mind you, I'm not on the side of the developer at all. But there is a level of accountability that the user needs to accept. And it's unfortunate because there's a lot of different social issues that go along with that. School, child care, things that are beyond our control, but these are real issues. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah. I actually was in Opa-locka for the first time on Sunday.
Oh, awesome.
And I love it. I mean, I've been living in Miami for like 23 years. And I felt that, when I saw the community center with the mural and I saw the streets, and I'm like, maybe it's like the next, place in Miami, like Winwood or Little Haiti or like, so there is any plan to, give people ownership or like, some sort of rent control so like people can still live there when like, developers come and all of that, or nothing like that can be done,
You mean utopia, or you mean?
Well, I hope, I hope utopia can be possible, like there is any plan, like to get like ownership or like rent control or like something like, so to keep people living in there, I mean.
Not that I know of, not that I'm a part of, just simply because when you live in these type of neighborhoods, the only thing that you can find is a P.O. box, and you don't know where the P.O. box goes or who owns that development. So how do you give ownership to somebody that's renting? I don't really know how that works. But what I can say is what we do that's coming next, I think it's like the final portion of our, what we call the campus in Opa-locka, is a container marketplace. And so that marketplace and commercial kitchen is to allow people in a neighborhood who have culinary skills to utilize a commercial space to grow their businesses. Because the problem is that it costs a lot of money to use a commercial space. So we can give you the economic knowledge and a small business loan to grow a business from scratch where you retain ownership, then we don't have to displace you from a neighborhood because you can grow it there, right? But again, you get to this issue of who wants to move to Opa-locka, because people say there's no affordable housing, but there's no affordable housing in Winwood, or there's no affordable housing in downtown, or there's no affordable housing in Brickell. There's affordable housing in Opa-locka. I mean, I like to personally call it first world problems. Like, I didn't make that up, somebody else did, but I love it. When you can say, well, there's no affordable housing in Brickell. I want my housing to be $1,300, not $1,800. It's like, you can go to Opa-locka right now and get a 4-bedroom for $995. But like, people don't want to do that. But if you did, we wouldn't have these issues, right? You can go move in these affordable areas. But then there's certain social stigmas that go with living in these neighborhoods. And that goes back to the user and understanding how do I maneuver around these issues. When I first moved here and I told people I live in Opa-locka, most of my friends would say, like what Rick Ross says in his songs. I'm like, yeah, that neighborhood. And they're like, you did it on purpose? Like, yes. But what's it like? And then they would come visit. It's like, wow, it's so quiet here. There's nothing happening. This is nothing like back home in Chicago. It's like, I know where we're from. You sit on the porch. That's the party. People drive past. Sometimes people get shot. Sometimes people get robbed. But you get a front row seat and you're just watching the whole thing. Not like that up there. I saw a hand.
Thanks. Great. Is the commercial kitchen the last thing that the community wanted, or are there other things they wanted that you haven't been able to deliver yet?
Well, the community wants everything.
Good.
The community wants, the community wanted a garden that was 5 times the size that we can give them, but that's the only land that we had. The community wanted a full-on building that's 2 stories. They can have whatever they wanted, but that's all we can give them. And that's where it comes to, is the limitations of what you have, right? Everybody wants the world, but you only can be given so much. And our team, and I'm really looking at Eileen because she's the one that writes all the grants, like, really does an amazing job of trying to fulfill the needs of these constituents. I just draw really cool things, and that's it, right? So I put it to paper. I make our visions something that funders can get behind and say, okay, that seems like it will help the community. Go ahead and put this into action. And we've been fortunate enough over the last 5 years I've lived here to do that at a very large scale, to where hopefully other neighborhoods can take this model and use it in their own neighborhoods and responsibly develop their neighborhoods.
The school project that you showed, I was wondering where those patterns came from that the buildings were described that you were using, specifically the black and white boxes. Can you talk about where that originated?
Sure. So the black and white pattern that was the facade of the housing development was based off of how I felt as though I experienced the world. And it was essentially that I had to change my diction depending on where I was. So when I was at home, I can say, hey, go answer the door. Or, Ma, can I get some more food? But when I would go outside, I'd have to say, can you please close the door behind you? I would like to go eat. What do you expect to do next? Right? And so that influenced the way that I designed the building and the way I applied that outside sort of appearance based off of those social locations.
So it's kind of a double voice.
Yes. Okay. I think this is the last question.
Okay. What do you think as a designer or as an architect about the Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C.? Whether you like that it has that color, does it represent you, the scale, the location, everything? Thank you.
So one of the things I learned, and that's very unique about Miami, is there's a spectrum of blackness, and there is a spectrum of Latin America, and there is a spectrum of whiteness, stuff that I had no idea living in Chicago. When I moved here and somebody said, what are you? All I would say is I'm black. They say, but where are you from? Chicago. Where's your family from? Chicago. Not knowing that there's Bahamian, there's Panamanian, there's Dominican, there's Cuban. There's a host of Afro-Latinas who would get physically upset with me when I would say I don't speak Spanish. And then I would learn from the other way that there's Argentines and Colombians and and Puerto Ricans who, if I saw them, I would think they're from Minnesota or Indiana and had no idea that they were Latin American. And so I say that because the African American Museum in DC doesn't necessarily respect my blackness, right? That was done by a African architect, David Adjaye, who grew up in the UK. His idea of blackness is vastly different than my idea of blackness. So I can't acknowledge from a personal relationship the patterning that's on the building because I didn't grow up with that ancestry. I don't know that part of where my family is from, right? I've done the Ancestry.com thing where they tell you your genomes are from these certain locations. I'm like 7% Scandinavian, which is like bizarre, but it is what it is. But when I see those patternings, I don't understand what that means. But what I do understand is the significance of such a structure. And that significance is that you have a building that was designed by two black men, Phil Freelon, probably the most famous American black architect, and Sir David Adjaye in his office. And it's in one of the most prominent locations within DC on the mall, which basically says, we helped build this country, we're here, finally freaking acknowledge us. And so that in and of itself is a very powerful gesture. And I'm going there for the first time this summer because I won a very prestigious research grant to go and see the place and go through the archives and do more research on black spaces. And that's the first place I'm going to go visit. And I'm going to hopefully stand there and marvel at such a large gargantuan building that black people designed in a city that black people weren't wanted, in a country where we weren't acknowledged, in a place where we didn't have rights, in a place where my parents who grew up in Mississippi and Arkansas had to deal with a whole lot of racial discrimination that I can't even explain or attempt to deal with. I get mad when somebody stands like 4 feet away from me and I'm the approachable black guy. So I can only imagine how they feel. And you guys are laughing, but it's true. Like there really are these social standards of the approachable black guy versus the non-approachable black guy, and it's usually based off of skin color and stature. I'm vertically challenged, so it makes me less dangerous. And then I guess my Scandinavian ancestry makes me lighter, so now I'm even more less dangerous. But these are things that we deal with in the built environment, and I'm just very happy that we finally have that structure. And now I hope that we have more structures that don't necessarily have to be by a starchitect, but can be made by a regular architect that just happens to be black. And then we no longer have to say, look at that black building. It's just, look at that dope piece of architecture. I think that's a good way to end it. I thank you guys for coming. This has been a lot of fun.